Namaskar and welcome to the fourth podcast of Text Concepts. Our topic for discussion today is insertion of Explanation 3 to Section 37(1) of the Income Tax Act. Explanation 3 has been inserted to expand the ambit of those expenditures which are considered either prohibited by law or are for compounding of an offence or have been incurred against the regulations or the guidelines which are part of the public policy of the country. To understand the rationale of insertion of Explanation 3, I would take you back to an age-old controversy. In very broad terms, let me define it as whether the Income Tax Act is a mere fiscal statute or does it have a role to play in social policy, in public policy, in some ways impacting the behavior of the businesses as well as the behavior of the individual citizens. To understand the minor nuance of this controversy, let me take you through three very interesting pronouncements of the different courts. And the first of this case is the case of Dr. T.A. Qureshi versus Commissioner of Income Tax. It's a 2006 judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court, reported in 157 Taxmann, page number 287. The brief facts are that Dr. Qureshi was found by the Income Tax Department to be manufacturing and dealing with drugs that are prohibited by law. However, in the tax returns that were filed by Dr. Qureshi, he claimed the loss for seizure of these drugs as an allowable expense. The department succeeded up to the High Court, wherein it was held that such seizure of prohibited drugs could not be allowed. However, the Supreme Court, in the cited judgment, reversed the verdict of the High Court, and it held that once Dr. Qureshi is taken to be indulging in a business, and that business is of manufacture and sale of prohibited drugs, then the seizure of the drugs from him is nothing but something which is an incidental loss to his conduct of the business. And it has to be allowed as a deduction. To quote from the judgment of the Honorable Supreme Court, let me read the following paragraph to you. The Supreme Court held, and I quote, "In our opinion, the High Court has adopted an emotional and moral approach rather than a legal approach. We fully agree with the High Court that the assessee was committing a highly immoral act in illegally manufacturing and selling heroin. However, cases are to be decided by the court on legal principles and not on one's own moral values. Law is different from morality, as the positive jurist Bentham and Austin have pointed out." Unquote. The second case is of CIT versus Khemchand Motilal Jain, and it is a 2011 judgment of the Madhya Pradesh High Court, and it is reported in 13 Taxmann.com 27. And the facts here are that Khemchand Motilal Jain was dealing with the tendu leaf, and one of the employees, Sukhananda Jain, was kidnapped when he was on a business trip to procure the tendu leaf for the firm he was working with. And he was in the custody of the kidnappers for 20 days. Police was informed, nothing happened. Eventually, the firm paid a ransom money to the kidnappers to release their employee Sukhananda Jain, and the ransom money payment was claimed as an expenditure. The Madhya Pradesh High Court allowed the ransom money paid for the release of the employee by using the principle that this is an expenditure which is incidental to carrying on the business of tendu leaf. The third judgment, which explained the finer points and the nuances of allowability or disallowability of what is expense which is prohibited by law or which is for compounding of an offense or which is not permitted. Let's go through the judgment of CIT versus CapScan and Diagnostic Center Private Limited. It's a 2012 judgment of the Honorable Punjab and Haryana High Court and reported at 25 taxmann.com, page number 92. Herein, the commission paid by the diagnostic centers to the doctors for attracting the reference from the doctors to the diagnostic centers was disallowed on the ground that this was against public policy. This was against the guidelines that the Medical Council of India had raised. And the judgment also gives some mention of how it goes against public morality and the normal behavior expected out of the law-abiding citizens. So these three judgments show to us the complexity of the issue involved in deciding whether an expenditure or a loss which is in our moral values not the right kind of expenditure is to be allowed in business or not. In my opinion, by insertion of explanation 3, the legislature has very clearly shown its intent that the Income Tax Act is to be used for purposes beyond purely fiscal measures, and it is to guide our social behavior, and maximum number of such expenditures which are against the public policy, against the regulation, against the guideline, against the law of the land will not be allowed as a deduction under the Income Tax Act. In segment 2 of the podcast, we examine the language and phraseology of explanation 3 to try and understand the particular situations in which it will come to play. The explanation 3 has 3 different clauses, and let's do it each clause wise. Now, the clause A reads, expenditure incurred for any purpose which is an offence or is prohibited as per Indian law or law outside India. So the first point I'm emphasizing is that the legislature has now expanded the ambit of definition of offence to the laws outside India also. This has been done because number of judicial forums had held that explanation 1 to section 37(1) is limited only to offences that are so defined in the Indian laws. So the moot point here is now an act which is an offence in the laws outside India is also a disallowable expense. Now, the other core point is that what is an offence? Offence is not defined in the Income Tax Act, and for this purpose, we have to refer to the General Clauses Act or the IPC to understand what constitutes an offence. And the clearest statement of this under the tax laws is given by the Honorable Supreme Court in a very recent judgment in the case of Apex Laboratories Private Limited versus DCIT. It's a 2022 judgment reported at 135 taxmann.com at page number 286. And I quote from the judgment. The Act does not provide a definition of these terms under Section 238 of the General Clauses Act 1897 defines offence as an act or omission made punishable by any law for the time being in force. Under IPC, Section 40 defines it as a thing punishable by this code, read with Section 43, which defines illegal as being applicable to everything which is an offence or which is prohibited by law or which furnishes ground for civil action. It is therefore clear that explanation 1 contains within its ambit all such activities which are illegal, prohibited by law, or are punishable. So, as understood by the Honorable Supreme Court, an offense occurs upon violation of breach of law which is punishable. Now, a question would arise also is whether the violation or breach of law would be regarded as an offense until it is proved, or a mere filing of allegation that an offense has been committed is good enough. In this, again, there are a number of pronouncements which says that it is the finding of the authority which is supposed to govern a particular law that is relevant. It is either the judgment of a trial court or the finding of the authority entrusted with the responsibility of governing and superintending the particular law which defines when an offense has been committed. And it is to be emphasized that the revenue authorities or the tax authorities cannot define what constitutes an offense, and it is for the courts or the authority in which this power is vested to decide what constitutes an offense and when the offense has been committed. In this, a judgment I would like to quote, which clarifies this point, is reported in the name of Pact Securities and Financial Services Limited versus ACIT. It is 2014 judgment of the Hyderabad Tribunal, reported at 50taxmann.com. Page number is 371. Here, in the regular course of money lending business, the assessee NBFC had advanced loan to the sister concerns, which subsequently became bad. This was disallowed by the AO on the ground that granting of the loans to sister concerns was prohibited by the guidelines of the RBI. The tribunal held in this case as follows. So far as the other allegation of the AO that the assessee has not adhered to the guidelines of the RBI, in our view, the AO is not the competent authority to decide that issue. It is for the RBI to take a decision whether the assessee has actually violated any guidelines or not. So the moot point here again is that the income tax officer or the revenue authorities cannot step into the shoes of either the trial court or the authority in which the power is vested to govern and monitor a particular law, and only when that authority gives a finding that a violation has taken place, which is punishable under the law, that an offense is committed. 3 points need to be clarified with regard to an offense. The first is that an act of omission or commission is an offense if it is so held by any court or the regulatory authority. The right to appeal does not change anything. So, if an act has been committed and it has been upheld to be an offense by a trial court or by the regulatory authority, then no expenditure shall be allowable as per explanation 3 to section 37(1) of the Act. However, if a person is agitating and appealing, then the expenses which are associated with the appeal are an allowable deduction. This is an old case law which comes from the Honorable Supreme Court as far back as 1971 in CIT versus Birla Cotton Spinning and Weaving Mills Limited, and it is reported at 82 ITR, page number 166. It also needs to be noted that only the penal part of the expenses are to be disallowed. If any compensatory payments are to be made with regard to an offense, then those are an allowable deduction, and this has been repeatedly held so by the various judicial forums. Now let's quickly come to discuss what is clause C of explanation 3. The clause C reads as expenditure on compounding of offence under any law in India or outside India. Now, compounding of an offence is a process whereby the person or an entity committing the default files an application admitting that it has committed an offence, but the same should be condoned. The defaulter is reprieved of major legal consequences by affording him an opportunity to pay a sum of money to escape prosecution. Now, there was a judicial controversy as to what kind of compounding fees are to be allowed as an expense and what are not to be allowed. Say, for instance, the Delhi High Court in the case of CIT versus Loknath and Company, reported at 17 Taxmann 209, had held that the compounding fees paid by a builder to regularize the construction of the building made in violation of the building laws is an integral part of the profit earning process, and therefore it is an allowable deduction. By introduction of clause C to explanation 3, the legislature has made it very clear that any expenditure on compounding of an offence and an act which is an offence under the law in India or even outside India is no longer to be allowed. Now let's examine the clause B to the explanation. Clause B deals with, and I read, expenditure incurred to provide any benefit or perquisite, the acceptance of which is non-compliant under any rule, law, etc. The disallowance shall be attracted if the recipient is barred from accepting such benefits or perquisites as per the governing law, even if the rules, regulations, etc. are not binding on the person who is giving benefits or perquisites. Now, this is more or less been enacted to cover the controversy which has arisen out of the payments made by the pharmaceutical companies to the doctors to propagate the use of their drugs in preference to the other prescriptive drugs. Now, here the legislature has expanded the ambit to include in itself rules and regulations as well as guidelines. Now, the rules, regulations, and guidelines are to be understood that it is not merely a process of regulation of a particular thing, but it is regulation of a particular law, the violation of which is prohibited under the relevant statutes, and a particular regulatory authority is there to implement that particular guideline or regulation. And in any case, it must be appreciated that the Constitution of India in Article 13(3)(a) defines a law to include any ordinance, order, bylaws, rules, regulations, notifications, customs, or usage having in the territory of India the force of law. So the underlying principle is that any breach of a law, of a regulation, or a guideline which is punishable, which is considered against the norms which have been laid down, against the law which has been laid down, against the regulations which have been laid down, is no longer to be allowed. And this has been accepted now by the Honorable Supreme Court also in a very recent judgment which is reported under the name of Apex Laboratories Private Limited versus DCIT. It is a 2022 judgment reported at 135 taxmann.com, page number 286. So the clause B of the explanation is expanding the ambit of the items which are prohibited under the law, which are considered offence, which are considered violative of any regulation or guidelines which have been issued. And importantly so, it is the laws and regulations and guidelines relevant for the recipient of such benefit, which is to be considered. Once again, a plea had been taken under the certain forums that the pharmaceutical companies are not prohibited for giving incentives to the doctors. So here, the legislature has taken care to ensure that even if the pharmaceutical companies are not prohibited, but if the doctors receiving such benefits violate the guidelines and the regulations set by the Medical Council of India, then such an expense will not be an allowable deduction. In the concluding segment of today's podcast, we deal with the issue whether Explanation 3 to Section 37(1) is retrospective in nature. The explanation begins with the phrase, "For the removal of doubts, it is hereby clarified." A prima facie reading of this phrase would suggest that the Explanation 3 is retrospective. It does not lay out any new act. It does not pronounce a new law. It seems to be clarifying the existing provisions of the act. It seems to lay out the correct application of an existing law. Now, the principle is that if any enactment is merely declaratory or clarificatory, then it can be presumed to be retrospective in nature. On this, let's read G.P. Singh's principle of statutory interpretation, and I quote from page 567. It says as follows: "An explanatory act is generally passed to supply an obvious submission or to clear up doubts as to the meaning of the previous act. It is well settled that if a statute is curative or merely declaratory of the previous law, retrospective operation is generally intended. The language shall be deemed always to have meant or shall be deemed never to have included is declaratory and is in plain terms retrospective." Unquote. After careful examination, I am of the opinion that the prima facie field is not the actual situation, and the Explanation 3 to Section 37(1) is prospective in application, and it will apply beyond 1st of April 2022. I am of this opinion because a careful examination of both notes on clauses as well as explanatory memorandum of the Finance Act 2022 suggests that legislature clearly wants the application of the Explanation 3 to Section 37(1) to begin from 1st of April 2022. Compare the notes and clauses and the explanatory memorandum with the amendments which the legislature has brought in Section 35 and Section 40 of the Act. Here, the legislature wanted the operations to be retrospective, and the language used in both notes and clauses and explanatory memorandum makes it very clear that it is retrospective in nature. So both the notes and clauses as well as the explanatory memorandum to the Finance Act 2022 supports that Explanation 3 is prospective in application. I am also supported by the observations of the Honorable Supreme Court on this issue in two judgments. The first is a 1995 judgment in the case of CIT versus Patel Brothers and Company Limited, and it is reported at 81 Taxmann 156. Herein, this Honorable Supreme Court considered the amendment to Section 37(2)(a) of the Act, which also began with the phrase "for the removal of doubts." And the Supreme Court held that the phrase "for the removal of doubts" is not decisive of the meaning and scope of a section as far as its retrospective or prospective application is concerned. The second judgment is in the case of Aqua Technologies Limited versus CIT. It's a recent judgment of 2021, reported at 129 taxmann.com at page number 145. Herein, the Honorable Supreme Court has held that removal of doubts can be both prospective or retrospective, and it depends on whether the amendment alters or changes the law as it stood earlier, or is it merely explanatory. And I have already stated that explanation 3 to section 37(1) increases and enhances the ambit of those disallowable expenditures which are for compounding of offences or are prohibited by laws or are not permitted by the guidelines or regulations of the public policy. So since explanation 3 is expanding the scope of section 37(1)'s disallowabilities, then it cannot be held that it is merely clarificatory or declaratory, and then the retrospective application of it cannot be presumed merely by the use of the language that it is for the removal of the doubts. To sum up, I am of the firm opinion that explanation 3 to section 37(1) is prospective in application, and it will apply from 1st of April 2022. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope you have a wonderful fortnight, and we will meet once again for the 5th episode. Thank you.